All right. Matt Vader, why don't you tell us about the movie you picked?
I picked John Carpenter's Escape from New York, starring Kurt Russell and a bunch of other guys.
Very famous.
Lee Van Cleef.
Borgnine.
Yeah, it's 1988 comes around and everybody goes crazy, I guess, because the crime rate shoots up to
90%.
Guess who was born in 1988?
Oh, you sweet summer child.
Yep.
So in 1988, the crime rate
funny.
goes up 400% across the nation. So they decide to turn Manhattan Island in New York City into a national prison. They build a giant wall around it. And if you're a criminal, you get thrown in there and that's it. The rule is once you go in, you don't come out. And then, so of course, we fast forward to 1997, the big year of 1997. The future, which always is kind of keeping me out because we're living into all these future movies. And a terrorist hijacks the president's plane, Air Force One. That's correct, yes. And crash landed in New York City on purpose. Along comes Snake Plissken, who was going to jail because he has been captured for robbing the Federal Reserve or something, if I remember correctly. And he's a ex-Marine or something, Special Forces guy. And they say, hey, I need you to go in and rescue the president, and we'll give you a pardon. And that sets up the movie, except for they put a thing in his neck
to force him to
go, and it's going to blow his head off in 22 hours if he doesn't finish the mission, because there's a time frame with what the president was doing with this meeting with the Russians and Chinese and stuff. So,
wow. Man, how poignant is that?
Yeah,
build the wall,
and that's the plot.
That's the setup for the plot. So, what do you love so much about this movie? Why'd you pick it?
I picked it because I was just wanting some nostalgia. That movie, nice dystopian future kind of movie, and I kind of like those things. And it was hitting the old retro button for me because we were talking about these movies a couple weeks ago. Yeah, and I just wanted to see it, and I did. It was great. I loved it, and it hit all those buttons. So, it was made in 1981, so it was right in there with the whole Empire Strikes Back kind of vibe, and those movies back then were kind of interesting to watch because they were like right on the cusp of a new kind of filmmaking, as far as I'm concerned, with the special effects and all this kind of stuff, and it was just interesting. I liked how it went.
I have a confession to make. I had never seen this movie before.
I had neither.
I knew of it. I knew the plot because the plot's been recycled a million times. Everybody rips off Escape from New York. Yeah. And of course, I'm Kurt Russell. It's one of his most known characters that he's ever played. Thank you. One of his most iconic characters that he's ever played. The man was speaking. he always uses better words than I do.
I have the best words.
He's got the best words.
All the good thoughts come from Kadish.
Yeah. Kadish needs to tell me what to think. Anyway, so I was really excited to actually sit down and watch it from start to finish. And I mean, obviously I've seen clips on YouTube and whatnot, and I have an idea of what it was about, but I never really got to sit down and just watch Escape from New York. And I got to do it. And I was like, exactly, like, yeah, this is... You can't change it. It's perfect. It is exactly what it needs to be, and I loved every minute of it. I didn't even think it was overly cheesy. Like, there's some definite like 80s cheese to it, but as far as in the movie, it takes itself seriously enough that you're like, okay, no, this is really happening. I think the thing that almost had me on the cusp of like, this is ridiculous, was the Duke from New York. And he was driving around in his like
with the
chandelier duct taped to the front. Yeah. I'm like, why?
I kept trying to get Kadish on board with us putting chandeliers on our cars.
Where did that future go? Like, I want chandeliers on my car.
I thought it was kind of
disco balls.
That's how you know you've made it.
Exactly. You're the Duke.
Shaft driving around with chandeliers on his front of his car.
Yeah, exactly. It was that was the one thing I was like, wow, that's some dated dystopian future stuff.
Well, Alex, you want to have your mind blown?
Go for it.
There's actually a very strong connection of Escape from New York with Jurassic Park.
What? Oh my God, you're going to kill him.
Yeah, I know. The cinematographer for Escape from New York, Dean Cundey, was the same cinematographer Steven Spielberg used for Jurassic Park. And he also did movies like the Back to the Future movies and Roadhouse and The Thing and Apollo 13. So very well-respected cinematographer. In fact, he used special lenses that had never been used before on the cameras that allowed them to shoot in super low light because the entire movie takes place at night.
Very dark, yeah.
So like the way he lit it was very minimalist, but because of the new lenses that he was kind of pioneering for the shoot, they were able to get some like really fantastic shots at night. And funny enough, Escape from New York is not shot in New York at all. No. It's shot in
St. Louis.
like St. Louis, and like a burned out area of the city.
Well,
and
they needed something that looked shitty.
Yeah, and John Carpenter.
No, that's
100% true.
They sent their scouting locations across the country. Said, find us a city that looks like it's been destroyed.
Yeah.
And they found this area of St. Louis
in its heyday.
Yeah.
And they actually bought a bridge.
Surprised they didn't go to Detroit.
They bought a bridge in St. Louis for $1.
Yep.
And that's where they shot like the final like scene,
big
and then
battle
they
scene,
sold it back to the city for $1 after they were done filming.
You know why though? It was funny because the city didn't want to be liable for any accidents that would happen.
Oh, is that why they did that?
So they sold it to the company and then bought it back after the movie was over.
That's some shady business right there. I like that. That bridge scene was when the IED, the explosive on the ground, blew the cab in perfect half, and it just the front end kept driving and the back end stopped. I was like, wow.
Yeah.
I guess that's how physics work.
That was sad.
You can't make that shit up.
No.
You know what's interesting though is that the studio. So, John Carpenter, kind of his best movies have Kurt Russell in them. But at the time, they'd only worked together once before, and that was on like the TV movie Elvis. And at the time, Kurt Russell was trying to break out of his Disney mold because he was like, a big Disney star growing up. And so he was trying to do like more edgy roles to kind of, expand his ability to get cast in other stuff.
Mission accomplished.
And the studio wanted Tommy Lee Jones as Snake Plissken. And John Carpenter was like, no, I want Kurt Russell. And then they were like, okay, if you don't want Tommy Lee Jones, how about Charles Bronson? And Carpenter was like, no, I want Kurt Russell. And they kept going back with him and saying like, okay, you don't want Charles Bronson, but what about this guy? What about this guy? And he's like, God damn it, I want Kurt Russell. And so finally they let Kurt Russell take the role. And it was really interesting because Kurt Russell based his performance on Clint Eastwood's The Man with No Name, the spaghetti Western character. And Lee Van Cleef, who plays the warden, was in all those like Eastwood spaghetti westerns. So like it was just kind of trippy seeing Russell like do his Clint Eastwood impression against Lee Van Cleef. So Kurt Russell also, he was the one who gave Snake the eye patch, and he didn't tell John Carpenter he was going to do it till like he showed up on set
with an eye patch
with an eye patch on, and Carpenter was like, yeah, okay.
Yeah, it works.
Let's go with it.
I thought the little character moment where he was the warden or whatever that guy's the job was, I don't remember, but
he was a warden.
Was he a warden?
Yeah.
He was like, your name's. He kept calling him Pliskin, Pliskin, and
Call
the guy's
me
like,
Snake.
call me Snake.
Yeah.
My name's Snake, and I'm like, oh my god.
That's what his mother named him.
Yeah.
You will
And
call
then-
him by that.
And then the character growth at the end is very much like he's like, all right, Snake, whatever you say, and he's like, call me Pliskin. I'm like, wow, what an arc.
180.
Oh man,
And it was funny because like the running gag in the movie is, so Snake Plissken's so legendary because he's like this big World War III war hero, and like all these scumbags have had run-ins with him in the past, and everyone, whenever they see him, they're like, Snake, I thought you were dead. And it's just like this running gag throughout the movie where everyone who meets him is like, oh, I thought you were dead already.
Yeah, it's like everybody in the prison knows who Snake Plissken is.
yeah, of course.
Yeah,
It's great.
I had never seen this movie before, and the whole time, every single time he meets a new character, they're like, "Oh shit, you're Snake Plissken," and I was like, "How does everyone in this walled-in jail know who he is?"
It's got to be like a.
Kadish was like, "Well, he's that big of a deal."
He's Snake Plissken.
He's kind of a big deal.
It's like a Chris Kyle thing. Like everybody kind of knows the name of Chris Kyle.
No, it's more like Osama bin Laden. It's just like he's infamous in this world.
Okay, infamous.
Yeah, infamous. Like he's the outlaw. He's like the quintessential outlaw in this world.
Okay, I was going for the war hero thing, but that makes sense.
Well, he was.
Yeah,
Something
that
like
makes
that.
sense, and that's why everybody thought he was dead, because if he's that much of an outlaw, he should have already been in there.
Either that or, talk about world building. Like one of the great things about Escape from New York is that they create this interesting world, and it's kind of expanded upon in Escape from LA later on. But like there's all
I
this.
love that movie.
Getting into sequels? I've never seen the sequel.
There's all
I
this
saw the
stuff.
sequel first.
Really?
So that's why I think I wasn't really that interested in seeing Escape from New York. So I was like, oh, Escape from LA. I kind of already saw it. Meh.
But there's this whole thing about Kansas City in both movies where like some stuff went down in Kansas City involving Snake, and they keep referring to it, but they never really tell you what it is.
All right. I want a spin-off movie.
Well, yeah, like I think there's actually a comic book that did like Escape from Kansas City, where they kind of expanded upon like what happened there. I'm not really sure on that, but I know that after Escape from LA came out, they were talking about doing a third movie and creating a trilogy and calling it Escape from Earth, where basically Snake just gets so fed up that he just like gets off the planet.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes, please.
I would watch that for sure.
But you know that this is an interesting action movie because there's not like a whole lot of action in it. It's very slow paced.
It is, yeah.
Kind of film, and it can be boring in parts because there's not a lot of dialogue. Like Snake's character in particular, he doesn't talk a whole lot.
But sneaking around the city by himself.
It's one of those movies where like I feel like when I'm watching it, I'm just kind of like going along for the ride, and I'm not really entertained. But then when I think about it and I talk about it, like it becomes so much better. You know. It's one of those movies that it lives on in your mind long after you finish watching it.
Yeah.
And like every character in the movie is kind of a caricature, but it works. Like, you know, they have the Duke of New York, and they have like, you know, the cabbie and like these different like over the top characters.
Oh, who was the cabbie? The cabbie's a
Ernest Borgnine.
Yeah, he's a famous dude too.
Yeah.
I recognize him.
Totally, you know, not necessary for the film. I think they just wanted to cast Ernest Borgnine in something like, let's make a role for him. But, you know, like I'm a huge John Carpenter fan, and this was like on his upswing right after Halloween, where he was starting to make like these like phenomenal movies like, you know, Big Trouble and The Thing and stuff like that, all involving you know, Kurt Russell. And you can kind of see like elements of Escape from, or Assault on Precinct 13 in this, with like in fact, I think the same gang member with like the crazy hair is in both movies. And John Carpenter, like during this time period, he just had this really bleak outlook on life. Like he was just like super cynical, and he wrote this movie after visiting New York and being like, "This place is a crap hole," you know. But everything about this movie, just as a film geek, appeals to me.
Yeah,
it's just a fun, interesting science fiction dystopian movie, and one of the great things about Carpenter is like, at least in his early days, he was very kind of almost like George Lucas in the sense that he was very pioneering in different film techniques. So we talked about the low light stuff, but if you know a thing or two about the special effects in this movie, so you know that all the computer grid stuff that's in the movie, it looks like, you know, an Atari based like grid system where they're going
flying
through.
in.
Yeah. None of that was computer generated because the computers at the time just didn't have the ability to do that. So they actually built models that had like reflective tape on them, and that they moved cameras through, and then they color corrected it and made it look like a computer generated image. Like it was freaking crazy.
That's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
Jude, have you talked about it yet? What did you think about this movie? Do you love it? Do you hate it? Do you just don't care? What's it?
I had never seen it before. I'm glad that I saw it. I don't need to see it again.
Yeah, when the movie was over, she was like, "That was stupid."
Nobody's gonna watch my movie either.
Well, it's because your movie was terrible. This one was good.
It was silly. I don't think I said it was stupid. I do drink a lot at night, though. It's but it was silly. I'm glad that I saw it. It was better than Escape from LA.
Way better.
Way better. It's. I think Vader nailed it with the nostalgia of the '80s. Yeah, I'm glad that I saw it.
That synthetic score from John Carpenter really helps set the tone for the movie.
I think when you think of quintessential must-watch action movies of the 80s, Escape from New York needs to be on that list.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can agree with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a class. Like I call it a classic, not just a cult classic, because it's
not
really
just
is.
A classic. It's a class act.
Yeah. So like, I mean, everyone from the 80s knows that movie.
Yep.
And loves it. And I feel like the older I get, the better the movie gets. Oh, fun fact though, James Cameron did all the matte paintings for
that's true.
Escape from New York.
He painted them himself?
Yeah, he was the matte painting artist in the special effects crew.
This is James Cameron.
James Cameron.
Before he got his big break. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
I did not know that.
And as long as we're still talking about the 80s, I couldn't help but notice the main love interest in Escape from New York was also the main love interest in Swamp Thing.
Mm-hmm.
I've never seen Swamp
And
Thing.
I think those are the only two movies she ever made.
Adrienne Barbeau, right?
Yeah. I was just saying, like, there were so many actors in this movie that, like for instance, Jamie Lee Curtis, she was the voice in the prison that you'd hear over the loudspeakers, but like she wasn't actually credited with that. She just did it as a favor to John Carpenter because they did Halloween together. But that was her voice. So like there are a lot of like cool little like cameos, like, you know, in this movie from recognizable actors from the 80s that I thought were really spectacular.
It's a great movie. It's a lot of fun. It's really cheesy. All these movies are cheesy. Mine's just terrible, but your guys' all are cheesy.
Yeah, we all based ours in the 80s, and you were like, I'm going to mess you guys up.
We're going to throw a wrench in this plan.
We were like, that's not what we meant.
How did you choose Angry Red Planet?
I told you already. I was just searching through and I was looking. I'm like, if we're doing like retro, I want to go like way, way back. I want to go to something that like nobody remembers.
I like how all of our movies were like, let's pick something from the 80s, and you were like, let's go retro. Like
80s is retro. Are you
80s
kidding
is
me?
retro.
There's a
60s is ancient.
Ancient.
That's
Antique.
Stone Age.
It's an antique.
That's classic.
Classic.
Classic. This wasn't a